we're happy to have our guests here tonight. We have three speakers, as you all know, from local schools, Rebecca, Aaron, and Nicole, who will also introduce themselves, and each are covering a different topic regarding accessibility in higher education. So I'm very excited to have them here. Prior to working at the library, I worked with Rebecca here for 3 years in accessibility in higher ed. So it is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and the reason why I wanted to create this program for the community to provide some information for all of you. So on that note, if you could all just introduce yourselves and your school, and then if you would, I always think this is interesting, just to let everybody know why you are in the field of accessibility in higher ed, what attracts you to this field.
I will go first, I guess. So my name is Rebecca Ross. I work at Widener University. We are located primarily in Chester, PA, but we also have a campus in Delaware and in Harrisburg. I work with all of those campuses for all of our students with disabilities around getting accommodations and making sure that there's accessibility there. I've been at Widener for over 7 years now, surprisingly. Before that, I used to work at an agency actually near Stratford Station, very close to here, working with adults in employment settings with accommodations, which were on the same kind of topic and under a very similar law type of framework, but in employment settings. The reason I'm in this field, well, I typically work with folks, with autistic folks my entire career, and so that's probably my gateway to it. But I really do love the idea of inclusion and really elevating this community and making sure that we're identifying access barriers and making sure that they are removed, because I think it is a population that sometimes is overlooked and has a lot of struggles that we have still yet to really solve. And so I like the idea of problem solving. It's been really a great time working at Widener and kind of making new channels and new opportunities in that way. So that's me.
Hi, good evening. My name is Aaron Spector, and I serve as the Director of Disabilities Services at the University of Pennsylvania. Today actually marks 3 years that I've been there. I realized that on the way over. Before that, I was at Temple for about a decade, so I've worked at two of Philadelphia's largest universities with students with disabilities in both settings. My path to this profession came through the special education classroom. I started out as a special education teacher in middle school and high school. Didn't last in the classroom very long. I found I was better suited to working with folks one-on-one in an office who are a little bit older. And so working with college students and university students has been really rewarding for me. And I just really enjoy working with students with disabilities, getting to know them, working with them as they develop from young adulthood to greater independence and unlocking the potential that comes with getting a college education.
Hi everybody, I'm Nicole Subik. I am the Director of Learning Support Services right down the road at Villanova University. I have been there for almost 13 years in all in Learning Support Services, but became the Director June 1st, 2020. Good timing. Nothing going on then. So I've been in that role for the last couple of years. And I didn't know this, known me for years, but my path to this kind of work is fairly similar. I was a special education teacher in high school. And I would say the impetus for getting into higher ed, besides it being, I think I'm more suited to this work as well, is that I did have a lot of students who would graduate and then I would see them later on and I'd say, oh, how's it going? Not so good. And I was very curious to see where that kind of gap was coming from high school and being successful in high school and then moving on to college and not having the same level of success. So that's one of the things that really pushed me into this work, which I love.
So I think I'm going to start us through, but I'm going to go over to the slides because I need talking points. So this is a good way for me to stay organized too. I'm a big advocate of visuals as well. But my topic through the night for this panel is going to be around the laws that are different between the K-12 system versus those that we work with under higher ed. I'll go through those laws specifically, but I want to make sure folks know that I'm
minimizing them a little bit to IDEA and the ADA. Those are the primary ones that work in this book for, that there are other laws to think about that have kind of like some relation to what we do day to day, like the Fair Housing Act and 504, like those things I think are a lot of nuance and complicated, so it's not quite as simple all the time, but this I think is the most important things to take away. All of your K through 12 students are primarily working under IDEA, especially if they have an IEP in particular. IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, has and offers a lot of supports and services. Those supports and services are typically around providing an appropriate public education, which is something I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment. But I want to make sure we know what the responsibilities are under this law, and then we'll go under the responsibilities under the law that we usually work under, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. For this purpose, the school can often identify a need for accommodation. So they might be working with your student anywhere in the K-12 system and say, there might be something here to get evaluated. Let's look closer into what the challenges here. They might see some struggles and identify a need to get evaluated. The school will also oftentimes make that evaluation and identify disability, identify what the impacts are, and identify what accommodations are appropriate considering those impacts. So if a student is working with dyslexia, right, they might say this student has struggled in reading, let's get them evaluated, we'll give them a psychoeducation eval, get them the diagnosis, and then identify what types of strategies and accommodations are going to be appropriate for that student. That's a lot of services that the school provides under that model. They also identify that whole plan. They have a team of folks that work around that plan. And oftentimes those planned goals are almost like treatment plan oriented. There's a lot of goals to say, all right, we're going to start here and get you more independent and maybe fade some of these supports over time, right? So those goals are almost look like a treatment plan. Like you want to make sure you have the supports you need and then maybe titrate or lessen them as you go through. But they also let all the teachers know, right? They let folks know that for which it's pertinent in their day-to-day academics, and they review it yearly about how effective it is. So they'll say, oh, our goal is for a student to be able to do this 6 out of 10 times by the end of the marking period, and then review it at the end of the year, whether they were able to achieve those goals and maybe fade back into less restrictive types of goals. That's what the school does in that scenario. The student is entitled to a lot of things under this law, including the free and appropriate public education. Okay, we will talk about that in a moment. But they also receive that psychoeducation eval. So every 2 years, typically, or 3 years, depending on your student and the diagnosis they're working with, they are typically reevaluated. And the one thing I tell all prospective students or all prospective college, future college students is to not let anyone convince you to waive that right away. That psychoed eval gives you a lot of data, and there's a lot of important things that come from that evaluation that you can use later. So every time I see folks with students in the K-12 system, I make sure that they know if they're saying, you know, we're not sure if we need to do this re-eval, maybe we need to waive it for this time. I suggest not doing that because the school is able to provide that reevaluation regularly. They're also entitled to Services 21. And also in this, under IDEA, parents are able to consent to plans and goals. I've named specific things under that. I've named all the things that are going to be different for once they get to college. So for college, our goals are slightly different. The student, for one, identifies to the college when there's an access barrier and a need. So teachers will largely not, professors, other folks on campus, identify a student, say, I think you might have a disability, and send them to eval. For a number of reasons. One, a lot of our students actually go to college and want to not disclose, right? So then identifying and outing a student can be very uncomfortable for them. So oftentimes they might refer folks to support services that exist for all students, but they are not commonly identifying a disability in a student. Also under the ADA, they asked us to engage in the interactive process. The interactive process for most schools is a couple of steps. Usually the student identifies what they want as an accommodation in writing. They, depending on the situation, will submit documentation that verifies the need based on a disability or diagnosis. And then they'll meet with somebody, maybe one of us. And a lot of my day is intake meetings and talking to folks. But those 3 pieces, that's what Widener's interactive process looks like. When you're looking at potential schools, it makes sense to ask what their interactive process looks like and what kinds of documentation they require as part of that process. specifically because now that they are not in the K through 12 system, the school is not going to probably be the one to evaluate and identify a diagnosis or disability. So when you're asking about the interactive process, ask what the documentation is, and if there's a timeliness component to it. Does it have to happen in a set period of years? Every school is different. We all kind of work off of what our interpretations of the ADA is. So you want to ask them, you know, how recent does it have to be based on this specific diagnosis? For me, for instance, if somebody's working with a concussion, it might have to be much more recent than somebody who has dyslexia, because concussions vary over time too much. So it really depends on the scenario, but you can talk to the school to figure out what their exact parameters are. But if you are talking about a diagnosis like dyslexia, a specific learning disability, those psycho-ed evals that your schools provide are very costly. I think one of the hardest conversations I have right now is when students come to me without it, and they think they might have a specific learning disability. The only way to really have that diagnosis is to go through that evaluation process, and it's cost prohibitive. So that's one of the reasons why I really push, you know, while you're in the K through 12 system, make sure to keep that heat on your school district, because they are, you know, able to do that for you. In the interactive process, the goal is for the college and the student to identify appropriate accommodations. So we're going to go through with a student request, but it's not always going to be exactly what's approved. The example I typically use is I had a student once ask for all of her professors to shave their beards. And so that sounds very interesting, like I clearly cannot do that. My professors would be very upset if I told them they could not, you know, to have certain things. But it made sense. She used lip reading, and when there was excessive facial hair, it's really hard to follow with lip reading. So we found another accommodation that would be for needs, but we only discovered that through that interactive process. The entitlements through the ADA is equal access. And so we'll go through that more specifically. We're going to compare equal access to the free and appropriate public education more specifically. But for our purposes, we want to make sure that equal access is the goal, which is why I love this comic, partially because I'm a nerd, but also because I think it's a good representation of what we do. We're not going to change the game, right? We're not going to change the win. We're not going to guarantee you're going to win, but we will make it so that you can play. Right? The goal here is that you have the same ability to access material as a student sitting next to you. So we're going to do whatever it takes to remove barriers as long as it's within reasonability, right? Like I'm not going to have everyone shave their beards, but we'll try to find a path to access. For all of these accommodations under the ADA, you are entitled to the fact that it's not at an additional cost. So if a student requires a single room for housing for whatever reason, they should be paying a rate that doesn't necessarily overcharge them for a single when they need it for a disability related reason, right? So you shouldn't be spending more money because of the accommodation. Also, it should come with minimal burden. Some of our students do have to do things that other students don't have to do, right? Like our students typically have to tell us when they're coming to take a test, so that I'm ready for them, I have their test, and I have a seat reserved. So we try to make it as minimal of a process as possible. We try to make sure that they can do it like 24/7. We have online access. We do what we can, but they should be as minimal of a burden as possible. And then also the big change from like the parental consent to goals and plans. Here, the student has control over the accommodation process, also their disclosure of their plans and when they use their accommodations. So we have some students, and Carla can attest to this from her time with me, that will come, get a plan in place, and then there will just be ghosts for months and months, because they really want to go without accommodations unless they absolutely need it. And some students don't use them. Other students will come to me around this time of the semester and say, you know what, I probably should have been using this from the beginning, and then start from there, and that's fine too. But it really is up to the student to make that decision. Similarly, a lot of schools will have specific disclosure policies about what professors do and don't know. Very often your professors are not knowing your diagnosis, the symptoms you experience, and why these accommodations in place, they're knowing what's approved. So the differences in scope, I focused on FAPE, or free and appropriate public education, and then equal access, because those are the, I guess, the parameters in which we decide what we can and cannot do in these plans. For the free and appropriate public education, which is that K through 12 model, they can guarantee success as long as the student is engaging with the system. And they do that by changing your curriculum and changing your learning objectives sometimes. They might lessen the rigor for a student. They might provide a totally different class section for a student in the K through 12 system. They might provide completely different content to master. So let's say you're learning Beowulf in a class, which was, for me, my most challenging book to read in the high school system. If a student's reading level doesn't make Beowulf accessible, they might have a whole different English class, or they might have a whole different assignment there. But it also can include providing personal services. And by providing, I mean actually tangibly, like giving them to you. That includes one-to-one support sometimes. It can include medical services and devices. It can include additional support services like a support classroom. There's a lot of services that sometimes exist in an IEP model that really is focused on that student's personal services, and including transportation to and from home, sometimes a door-to-door type of service. Again, I've highlighted specific things for a reason because these are the things that are different in the college environment. Equal access guarantees access. We don't make sure you can win the game. All of our students have an ability to succeed and an ability not to, and that's true for all students. So I can't guarantee folks are going to be successful in our academic program, but what we'll do is we'll remove barriers that exist connected to a disability. So that means for us, we will provide modifications to how you meet a learning objective, but I can't change that learning objective. If Beowulf is inaccessible at a college level, I'm not going to give a different, entirely different type of class for that. We might make Beowulf more accessible. We might make it so you can listen to it along with reading it. We might have technology that allows students to digest it piece by piece. We might refer folks to services that exist for all students, but I can't change that specific learning objective. We might make classrooms accessible, and we might modify methods of measuring mastery, which I did not think about how difficult that would be to say out loud when I wrote it. But like extended test taking time, that's the most common accommodation probably at any college, but also any high school. And then how we modify that method of measuring mastery. We modify tests by giving folks more space to take it, or as distraction reduced space to take it. We were just talking about testing center and all the logistics that are involved around that. So that's very common adjustment we make in the higher ed setting. So we might change the method, but we probably aren't going to change that you have to master that content. So you still have to get a grade on that test that puts you into the space where it's clear that you've mastered those pieces. We also can allow personal services, but we're typically not providing them. So I have students who have had support aides come with them that are provided by services outside of Widener for a myriad of reasons, but Widener isn't employing that person. We're just giving them the permission to have a second person within their spaces. We also can provide accessible versions of all the tools, programs, and services that we are available to students. So for transportation, per se, right? You might have door-to-door transportation in the K-12 system. What I would probably do is make sure that the transportation that we provide to all students is accessible to yours. So we have like a bus circuit, and that circuit goes certain places. We want to make sure you can access that circuit, that it's available to all students, but probably not an external route that's identified for a specific student. So anything that's available to students, we will absolutely make accessible. We'll probably not provide specific personal services. That's the difference with the ADA. The ADA specifically outlines what personal services and the limitations of what we can and can't provide there. However, most of your schools have support services available to all students, which is another question I would ask for your prospective students. Although I'm stepping on toes, I think I'm saying that. But that's something I would ask too. Like we have academic coaching or tutoring, or what you have as far as like your retention and other types of programming that's geared towards making sure your students have the things they need to succeed. So that is the quickest nutshell version of very big meaty laws that are meant to protect our students with disabilities from discrimination. But I'm going to pass it on over, and then Aaron, next right?
Yeah. I don't have slides, but
I wonder why it's finding so up there, even though it's not on here. It's just close, it's not way out. Thank you.
All right, so Carla invited me to speak about the college search process for students with disabilities and about requesting accommodations in college. So I don't have any slides, but I hope to give you just practical information from my perspective, having worked at a few different colleges and universities. Talked to many students and many families over the years. So I think the college search process for us, a high school student who has a disability, is in many ways the same as a college search process for their non-disabled peers. But I think there are a few situations where maybe the information about the disability services really does, and the accessibility of the campus really does take higher precedence. And so if your student is someone who has a mobility disability and uses a wheelchair or a mobility device, that's hugely important that you find out whether the campus, buildings, residence halls, et cetera, are available. I would be really strongly looking for a physically accessible campus or understanding the services available. If your student is someone who's deaf or hard of hearing, or blind or low vision, again, I think you want to get out in front of the college search process by really prioritizing that disability service information, finding out are the services that your student needs and relies on going to be available and provided. That comes first. Similarly, for some high school students who are on the autism spectrum, that may be a deciding factor in their college search. I would say at this day and age, the services available for students with autism do vary pretty widely from university to university, in that all campuses provide the legally required services that Rebecca just outlined, and many campuses are choosing to go beyond the law much farther in terms of offering a support program for students with autism. If that's the kind of thing that you think your student would benefit from, it is definitely worth finding out which campuses that you're interested in have that type of autism support program and learning a little bit more about it. Some schools that are offering additional services also charge an additional fee for those services. So that's important information to have as well. But that can be a big difference between getting, the kinds of accommodations that Rebecca described versus, getting some enhancements like an individual one-on-one coaching service each week, or social support, or access to counseling on a regular basis. Most campuses will have some form of coaching services or counseling services that any student can access, but it does require a little more initiative on the part of the student to go out and access those things. And what we see in an autism support program is just a little bit more of a coordinated effort to make sure that the students are accessing those services on a regular basis. And then one other group of folks I think who really want to get out in front of this question in the college search process, if your student has some real dietary restrictions, like very severe or complex food allergies or intolerances, again, I would just want to connect and bring that information up front in the college search process and see what that campus can do to meet your students' health-related needs. Again, that may not be the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about a disability, but it's something that we all do work with in our disability services roles. Many campuses require students to purchase a on-campus dining plan. If your student has multiple or severe complex food allergies, you may just want to find out what the options are and what that dining service is doing to make sure all students can eat safely, or is there an option to not participate in the dining plan and to prepare your own meals? So those are just a few groups and sort of conditions where I think the disability-related information may be a deal breaker in terms of the college search process, or just takes more precedence in terms of figuring out which schools you want to apply to, starting that process, inquiry a little bit earlier, and getting out to the, first on the websites, and then maybe calling and visiting a campus's disability service office. I think for everybody else, you want to think about what's the campus or the college experience that's right for my student. Where are they interested in going to school? Where are they going to be able to get into school? And some of those typical questions. Do they want a large school or small school? Do they want an urban campus or a rural campus? Those things may take greater precedence over disability services, because regardless of the school, they're going to have someone like the people here in front of you working in a disability service role, providing the legally mandated accommodations in ways that are just unique to that campus. And so I think many students conduct their college search, follow their interests, certainly see what type of academic program they're motivated to find out where that's offered. All the other factors about the school, and then at some point, if it's possible, to at least start on the website, look up the disability services and see what the processes are. Maybe you want to call the office and speak to someone. My last call of the day today was from the parent of a high school senior who was just trying to get a little bit more information about our processes at Penn. And then maybe you want to visit, and when you visit the campus, make an appointment to visit the disability service professional. Rebecca really pointed out the differences between high school and college services very well, and one of the main differences is how we engage with families. So there's a very clear role for the families in a kindergarten through 12th grade education setting, and you have a lot of rights and you have a lot of access. College disability services and colleges in general are often less forthcoming, less willing to engage with parents, but I would say disability service professionals, probably more than other people on campus, will talk to you. And what we'll tell you are general things. What are our policies? What are our practices? What can students access and how do they access them? And what we're listening for is all the specific stuff you want to tell us about your child or your student. We can't, because of the differences in the laws, we don't like to divulge a lot of specific information about how your student is doing at college. That's protected information, and they're an adult, and so we have to treat them as such. But we know that families are a great source of information about their student before they come to college, and even while they're there. But, you know, you may be hearing things about what's happening in that first semester that we should know about. And so we're always, I think I speak for everyone up here in the profession, we're always listening, eager to listen to you. So even when I get a call from a family member of a prospective student or a current student, and they want to know, how do you access this process? My student needs to this or that service. I'm happy to tell you what the general process is, and maybe I can follow up with and reach the student directly with that information if it's relevant. I think scheduling a visit with a disability service when you're doing college tours is another great thing to do. They may be a little unprepared if you just pop in right after your tour. There may not be someone available. We tend to have smaller offices who are booked weeks out with student appointments, and so sometimes it's a little harder to respond in the moment if someone just shows up on their doorstep. But we love to hear from prospective students and families when they're planning their college visits. And that gives us the opportunity to show you the office, introduce you to the relevant staff members, talk about what you can expect, and answer really those personalized questions that are harder to convey in a website or a general information session. So in terms of requesting accommodations at college, I think Rebecca really painted the picture for you that the school does not identify students and determine what accommodations they need. It's something that the student must self-identify and then request the accommodations that they need. In thinking about this, process for maybe next year or in the future, I think there's some things to do to prepare both ways to think about interacting with the college, ways to interact with current high school or healthcare providers in terms of getting ready for that request process, and ways to prepare your student for the change in how things work from high school to college. So, as I was saying before, to prepare for what the university needs, it's great to look up that information on a website ahead of time. I know most schools will list what the accommodation request process is, as well as what documentation requirements there are. And so as you're thinking about getting ready for that accommodation request and what types of supporting paperwork you need, it's great to review that website and then to follow up with a call if you have specific questions. I'd say most schools try to make sure that their documentation requirements are not overly burdensome. But there is variation from school to school in terms of what is required or what is preferred to have. Really though, like any documentation you have of your student's disability or medical condition should be enough to get you in the door and get a conversation started. And so that's a good place to start. In terms of thinking, preparing about requesting accommodations and how to involve your high school or your current healthcare team, again, they can really help you out with the documentation. Documentation is good. If you can get a reassessment in the later years of high school especially for a learning disability or ADHD or autism, and you get the school to provide it, by all means, take advantage of that. It's something you're entitled to while you're in the K-12 system. It is something that no one's going to do for you once you leave that system. And having an updated psychoeducational evaluation with adult norm tests, which usually kick in at around age 16, will really prepare you for what any school, even with the most rigorous documentation requirements, will have. And so, yeah, just can't stress that enough. Your school, your high school will do that for you. You can request it. And many of you may be used to having to push on your high school a little bit. And I think that's hopefully a difference between high school and college too, where you shouldn't have to push this hard at college level. But, you know, being a parent myself, I've started to get some of this experience that I kind of do abstractly from my professional role, that, you know, to get a 504 plan going, you may have to call, push, email, schedule that meeting and ask for it. And so keep doing that. Keep doing that right up until your student's out of high school. Having a copy of the IEP or 504 plan is helpful as well, because that shows a history of accommodations. Just keeping in mind, as Rebecca mentioned, those accommodations are not going to transfer over word for word into the college setting. We do a fresh assessment, but if we've seen a history of accommodations in the past and can understand where they came from and how useful they were, we're going to find probably it's reasonable to provide the same or some equivalent type of accommodation for most of those. So the IEP or 504 is a good document to have as well. If it's more of a medical related disability, rather than maybe a learning disability, just being in touch with your students. Healthcare team is important. They'll be the ones who provide updated documentation to support an accommodation request in college. I think those documentation requirements around medical conditions, physical disabilities, sensory disabilities can vary a little bit from school to school, but most of them will have a form of some sort that the healthcare provider can fill out. In terms of timeline, you want to do, you probably want to get work on this over the summer before freshman year. And so, say at Penn, students can access our system and request an accommodation just as soon as they get their login credential, which is usually sometime in mid-May, because we use an online form. And that probably won't be the case at most schools. If you reach out to the disability service much earlier than that, they'll probably say you can't request accommodations just yet. We're still working on, you know, wrapping up the current school year, but over the summer before the start of freshman year is really the best time to take care of that. I think over the course of the pandemic, everybody accepted that we have to have remote appointments, virtual appointments. And so maybe not all schools did that before. They would say, wait until orientation and come in and get your services set up then. At this point, I would rather meet you over the summer, get your services set up, maybe touch base again when you arrive at school for the fall semester to start, but certainly it helps everyone out. We can be proactive and get accommodation plan set up over the summer. In terms of your student, you know, they're the other person to prepare for this transition and for requesting accommodations in college. So they need to understand that they are the person who has to request accommodations. It can't be mom, dad, grandma, and it can't be the high school teacher. We have an online form, most schools do, where students type in what it is they're requesting. It's really weird when you see it in third person, like Aaron needs extra time on tests. Well, Aaron should be filling that out. I need extra time on tests. I need a copy of class notes. So getting a student used to being the one in position to advocate for themselves is really important. If in their last couple of years in high school, they can participate in the IEP meeting or the 504 meeting, the focus at that stage should be on transition planning. And so they should be invited to take a more active role in that meeting. Even if they're just sitting there listening, that's a step in the right direction. You may want to role play with them or brief them a little bit, because when they have to meet with the disability service professional, you may not be in the room. Sometimes you're, you know, welcome into a room, but it's really the student's call whether they want to have an adult there with them. And the disability service person is going to talk to the student. And so the student should be ready to answer questions. What services did you use in high school? Were they effective? Do you think you want to use those same services in college? How do you learn best? What subjects are the most challenging for you? How does your disability or health condition manifest itself? let's hope for the best, but plan for the worst. What does the worst day look like? What was the low point of your high school career? And so they can be thinking about those things, preparing themselves to talk about it. That's great preparation, and that's really what we do in terms of trying to work with a student over the course of their college career is to develop that self-advocacy skill. We recognize they do not come in with it. Some do, and that's fantastic. For many, their college years are the first time they really have to advocate for themselves for their services. But by the time they are graduating, if they're going to need these services in another school setting, in a professional setting, or even just for that self-awareness going out into the world, we hope that we will have taught them and given them a little practice with self-advocacy so that they take that with them. And so I think that's an important part of preparing the student for the accommodation process.
That was a good transition. We said repetition was good. Right?
Yes.
So, I'm gonna kind of start right where you left off. And as I'm bringing up my PowerPoint slide, I do want to say one more thing about documentation guidelines. I do think I'll tell anybody who will listen that we have a robust and informative website that we work really hard on. And I think almost every disability services type office will have a section of their website dedicated to those documentation guidelines. And it's one thing if it is a psychoeducational report, but if it is more medical related or maybe kind of got to ADHD in a different way or something like that, it's really important to look at those guidelines because I can't tell you how many times that I'll get, somebody will get an appointment with their doctor and then I'll get a letter that says, Dear Director Subik, Nicole has ADHD, love Dr. Smith. And that doesn't give us the information that we need, right? You can see how that would be, and I do all get that kind of thing as well.
Yeah.
And it's a hard conversation because the student will say, I got it, here it is. And I say, well, that might get your foot in the door, and we might be able to provide what we call something like provisional accommodations or temporary accommodations. But chances are you're gonna have to go back to that doctor, get another appointment, pay another copay, to kind of get the information that we really find useful in figuring out how to appropriately accommodate and support a student. So, I might need some help. Let's see. Thank you so much. So just kind of jumping right off of talking about self-advocacy. I work at Villanova, so this is our process, but I think you'll see some version of this at most schools where you're asked to provide that information either during the interactive process, more than likely in writing. And I just want to share the 3 questions that we ask every student who self-discloses to answer. And I do think, even though, I think there are some cases where I could say it might be good for a parent and a student maybe to sit down and do this together. It really is imperative that the student is the one to answer this. The first one being, describe your disability or disabilities. So this is exact wording from our form. How are your disabilities currently impacting your academic performance, ability to physically access classrooms or other spaces on campus, housing needs, dietary concerns, transportation, the greater Villanova experience, or other concerns. And this really gives, the student the chance to talk a little bit about what their disabilities are. And I think, from my experience in doing this for some time, some students right out of the gate have this information and are able to talk about what their disabilities are and how they do impact and what the barriers are. And if you're thinking right now, my child does not have this language right now, that's okay, but it's a really important skill to kind of develop, a muscle to grow and develop, because this information is really important. I think I do also see students who are coming in, and when they self-disclose, I say, well, talk to me a little bit about your disabilities. They say, I don't know what my disabilities are. And we see that as well. So I would really echo what Aaron said. And disability is not a bad word. Disability is part of the human condition. It's an identity. It's also something that makes some people experience barriers in navigating the world around them. It's okay to talk about that and for have students sort of understand what that is, what that part of their identity is, and how it may impact them in the college environment. So answering that question. And then the second question kind of talks about that accommodation history. We really want to know, we actually changed the language of this a little bit from what we originally had at Villanova. Not just what accommodations have you used in the past, but what accommodations have you used in the past that were helpful. The reason why we put that is because some students would just look on their IEP and just copy paste, which is okay, but we think that this is maybe gives the student a little more agency to talk about what was actually helpful. And it's such an interesting conversation because I think a lot of students who did have 504 plans or accommodation plans from private schools or IEPs will say, well, this was on my IEP, but I only used X, Y, and Z, or this is what I found to be true and helpful. And then asking what types of accommodations are you hoping to use at the school you're at? And this isn't like they have you get one chance to answer this, and if it's not on there, you get nothing. It's not like that. It's more of like, give us an idea of what are some of the things you anticipate. And I think sometimes this is a really good answer, like, yeah, pretty all-encompassing. And I think sometimes I'll also get, I really don't know, and that's okay too, but it gets us thinking about what are some of the things that might be relevant. Okay. As you're thinking about, for those of our friends listening online and people in the room, you know, how many questions can your student answer? Or students, how many of those questions can you answer? If you're thinking about that, if you're thinking, yeah, I feel like we're pretty good, I think you're on a good path. If you're thinking to yourself, none, or my student would have a really difficult time answering any of these questions, I think, you know, if they're in senior year or if they're taking a gap year and they're in junior year, I think now is the time. Now is the time to be part of that process and thinking about, you know, what a person's needs might be. And I think there are a lot of different good ways to do that. The thing I put in quotations on the side, the 411 on disability disclosure, it is an older resource, so I think it's a little bit dated. Do you all use that ever? It's a little older. I think it's from like 2010 or something, but I do often send this to students, and you can Google it. It's a free resource that was federally funded. And it does give the kind of bare bones idea about disability disclosure. And it's kind of in a workbook style. So you can print it out and slide it under their door, their bedroom door, maybe. But it does give some ideas about like, what are some of the things that you could be thinking about? And it focuses on higher education, but it also talks about the workplace and some other things. And I do think it plants the seed for a lot of students who may not be thinking about that quite yet. So it is a resource, I think. It's out there and free, maybe a little dated, but I think it's still a really good one. Couple things that I think are really helpful, and if you all disagree with me, feel free, I can take it. You know, one thing, kind of consider practicing your script. Aaron mentioned role playing. I think that this can be such a great tool for students as they transition to being their own self-advocate. You know, what are you going to say? Like, what do you want to say to somebody in our role, which our primary existence on a college campus, I mean, compliance, but also like just supporting students. That's one of the things I love about our role is like, you know, I'm not giving anybody a grade. I'm, you know, I just want, I'm a helper by nature. I want to help students. So we're a good person to kind of practice this with as well. But, you know, thinking about faculty and other stakeholders on a college campus, like, what do you want to say to faculty? I often will say to students when they're first going through this process, especially when it comes to the most popular accommodation, which is extra time on tests, right? You're gonna have to interface with your faculty member in some way to try to figure out how to do this. Some examples for why, you know, as much as you may try, every student ends up with back-to-back classes. So they may need to take their exam at a slightly different time, right? In order to get their extra time. That's something they're going to need to interface with their faculty member about. So when they send out an accommodation letter, which we do through an electronic system, they're going to need to follow up with them about some logistics and what their needs are. And we have some students who either put it in an email or go to office hours or find them after class, and they feel very strongly that they need to share some elements about their identity with the faculty member to have them really understand what their needs are. And that is a great thing to do. We have just as many students who say, I don't want to tell my professor anything about my diagnosis or anything like that. I want to stick to the accommodations and what I'm approved for and how that's going to happen. And they may say to the professor, you got my letter about my 50% extended time? How are we going to do that? Okay, great. And that may be the extent of their disclosure to the professor. I think those are both valid. It just depends on the comfort level and what the student wants to share. But I don't think the first time they're thinking about this probably shouldn't be when they show up at their professor's door, because that'll put them in a position that it can, be a little bit anxiety producing. Another thing to think about, or what are the barriers you think you might face in the classroom or the dorm or the greater community? I think folks in our field, the language is always changing, but we find ourselves often talking more and more about barriers. Like what are the barriers that you're seeing that are keeping you from doing X, Y, Z? So kind of thinking about that question, and what do you need to fully access the program? What do you need to function within a dorm setting? Gee, I don't know. That's a good question, right? Some students need a single, like was mentioned, for a variety of reasons. And some students really might have a real strong preference to live with a roommate for a variety of reasons. So kind of thinking through some of those typical college things can be really, really helpful. And that's a good time to mention, I do think there's a difference between need and preference. We all have preferences. Those don't hold any more weight for individuals who are disabled than they do for non-disabled classmates. Preferences might be something like, I would really rather have Rebecca as a professor than Aaron, because I've heard she's more fun. Or the opposite, whatever, right? Or Aaron's more fun than Rebecca, whatever it might be. That's a preference. I need to have Aaron because his class is earlier in the morning and my medication wears off, and Rebecca's class is late at night. That may be a need. And I think I can probably speak for my colleagues that we're kind of picking through those kind of questions a lot with students, okay? So working effectively with, an office like ours or any of ours, it's really important to understand how the Student Accessibility Office communicates accommodation needs to faculty. Just kind of learning the policies and procedures. It's all laid out on the website. It's probably in several different places, but I also know that there are some individuals that's not going to be the most accessible way for them to learn about it. I think most offices like ours are definitely willing to sit down with the student and walk them through it. We send reminders, we try to get to students in any way we can. But ultimately, it's going to be the student's responsibility to internalize those policies and understand how it all works. So who's responsible for sharing the accommodation letter? Every year, I will have a student who will usually come to me partway through the semester, and I've never seen them before, never heard from them, they've never sent an email, and they'll say, I didn't get my extra time. And I'll say, well, who are you? And they'll say, well, did my counselor from high school send all that stuff? And the answer is no. The answer is no. So understanding what a student's role is in being not just an advocate, but also adhering to our policies and procedures is really, really important. You're required to speak to faculty about your accommodation needs. I mentioned the testing, like try to figure out what is my what's my obligation, what's my responsibility. How does exam proctoring work? And that is really different at every different school. So whatever school your student ends up at, you're going to want to figure out how that system works. And who do I contact with questions? There's bound to be questions. I think questions are good. Communication, which is what I'm going to end on, really, really important. But who do I go to obtain this assistance about this different stuff? Generally speaking, we do not speak with faculty about students' diagnosis. There are some, I think, rare exceptions to that are almost in our school always approved by the student. I try to, I think that that's something a student should feel free to share. There's no shame in disability, it's part of the human condition, but I also think that that's their information to share. So that's important for parents to know when you think like, does Professor Spector know that my child has ADHD? Probably not, not unless they told him. Most of us do not have access to things like grades and syllabi. So if you as a parent are like, oh, I just found out, you know, that my child failed their first chemistry test, why didn't Rebecca say something? Because she doesn't know, okay? Unless we're told. If you think about the number of students we don't have that same kind of access that high schools give, that, you know, you can see what grades are posted and that kind of thing. And I think that is a surprise to some parents, so I do want to share. I too am a parent with a child in elementary school, and I can see every blessed thing that is happening, not so much for here, okay? And then, you know, we won't know if there's an issue with accommodations unless a student lets us know. So if a student's not getting their approved accommodation, whether it be a logistics issue or a miscommunication or a bad actor somewhere, we won't know unless somebody says something to us. And that may be something that you have a role. I find that students, because you're their moms, dads, or caretakers, will often pick up the phone and say, oh, this awful thing happened. I think, you know, a nice thing to do might be say, like, have you talked to, have you brought this to the attention of so-and-so, and helping coach them to bring those things up. I think a lot of students are comfortable with that, but there's also a lot of students who just don't want to make waves and don't want to think like there might be some kind of retaliation. That's verboten. No retaliation. We want to hear about things that are not going well. And it's also nice to hear about things that are going well from time to time. But if there is an accommodation issue, it's really important that somebody lets us know, and lets us know in a timely fashion. So if you're hearing that feedback, if you think to the future when your child is in a college environment, please encourage them to bring that forward. I personally would prefer to hear from the student, because then I can get the whole picture. And kind of going back to sort of thinking about our role, there are a lot of additional resources that vary from college to college. And I do think, you know, from being in the classroom for a short period of time as a special education teacher, I think the model is different in that when you have maybe, you know, case manager or something like that at school, they're sort of your go-to person for everything. And colleges generally don't work like that. I think people who are in our profession like to be helpful, and we, you know, try to answer questions when they come up. But the truth is, the chances of, you know, the disability office running tutoring, coaching, advising, all of these other things, we're not kind of that one-stop shop. So it's going to be really important to help your student understand that there are going to be different things that happen different ways. Right now at Villanova, we are preparing to register for the spring semester. And I have a lot of students asking me about their classes, which I'm happy to provide whatever feedback I have, but ultimately they need to see their academic advisor in order to actually register. I really can't help with that. You guys get involved in that at all?
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm always having it. A lot of times I'll say, that sounds like a good class, or that sounds like a lot of math. You know, that's the kind of people that feedback I can provide. But in terms of like, does this class count for this requirement? I don't know. That's a whole other department, a whole other thing. So I think if they're used to having sort of like a one-stop shop, and I think Aaron's point is really good in that I think people in our role are more willing to talk to parents and pick up the phone. But just because you can reach us doesn't mean we have the answers to everything, but we may be able to, you know, refer you elsewhere. But I would hope that you don't get too frustrated that we don't have all the answers. And just kind of the last thing, what role do parents play in working effectively with the campus student accessibility office? I think as a student transitions, especially if you've been fighting, I saw a lot of nods when they said you had to push the school district a little bit. A lot of you were like, which I believe. I don't think that there's like a brick wall that all of a sudden gets built in between that. I do think parents can be an important part of the transition, but it is a transition. I'm always happy to talk to parents, do a lot of listening. But I'll tell you a quick story and then I'll stop talking. But over the summer, I met with a parent and an incoming first year student on Zoom. The two of them were there. Everybody was cool with that. And the mom asked me a great question that I think will stick with me for a while. She said, what do I need to sign in order to be able to advocate for my son in the way that I have been over the last 4 years? And I said, nothing. I said, it's different. And to her credit, she was very receptive to hear that. I said, it's not gonna be the same way as it was before. And that is the truth. So kind of helping your student, your child to understand that, understand where you can be supportive and encouraging and where they need to kind of take the reins is a really important thing to work on over the next few months. So is this the question part of it?
Yes, thank you all. It's wonderful. Do you have time to answer some questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Rebecca from Widener, since you guys, Widener does internships, so how does that work with disability, you know what I mean, how does it work with your working with employers for the internship part of your programs?
It's a great question. So a lot of our academic programs have a practical component. So for engineering, say there's like a co-op where students will take that entire semester. We will work with the partner sites and talk about accommodations. The law, the ADA law that we work under is the same law that employers work under, which is why it was kind of easier transition from employment to higher ed for me from my previous job. So I will work with those sites and talk to usually there's a field site supervisor that we work with, and then there's usually a coordinator person at Widener that we use as like our intermediary. So it's probably a meeting with all 4 of us, and we'll talk about not every academic accommodation is gonna like make sense for that environment, but let's say per se we have a student who wants to make sure that there's a space that they can go to, they need to like de-escalate. We'll help the field site identify what that space might be or how we might be able to meet that need. It really depends on that site and the essential elements of that internship, but usually we can find accommodations that are commensurate. Yeah.
Any of this, is this all post-application acceptance process, or is pretty much?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I probably should have covered that in the college search, but yeah, students with disabilities apply through the same process as their peers. Generally speaking, disability is not considered in the admission process. It's not considered as a plus or a minus against any applicant. Some students do include something about their disability and say a personal essay, a personal statement, because it's an interesting part of who they are, or it's a challenge that they have, an adversity that they faced in their life. Or on occasion, it may explain something about their academic history, like I had 3 concussions junior year, and that's why I only got pass-fail grades or something like that. But other than that, unless again, maybe there's an additional special program for a population, the application process, the admissions process is the same, and then you get engaged with folks like us on campus after admission. That doesn't mean though that we definitely talk to prospective students who are just interested in thinking about applying. We do a lot of general information at that point, but we won't make any decisions, any hard and fast accommodation decisions at that point.
I will say some of the application process, usually there's an avenue to request accommodations there too. So we just had somebody request like a different version of the application so that they could handwrite into it instead of using a computer. So there's usually an avenue to request accommodations during that application process, but as far as these plans in place, yeah, we would wait until a student commits to Widener.
Yeah,
That May 1.
yeah, that's once a student sends their deposit in and is committed, then we don't want to see documentation. We won't review documentation or make decisions prior to that.
So like, do you honestly feel like if a child were to share in an essay, a challenge that they've had, I've heard people say like that may not be to their benefit when their application is reviewed because it could be viewed as a burdensome applicant or something like that, and just like the honest answer to that.
I'm happy to give you an honest answer. We have nothing to do with admissions. So I don't have any access to any admissions essay, so I have no data on that. And we do that purposefully. And And I think, I would like to think that the culture we created at our university would be open and inclusive and understanding, but the truth is, none of us know what's in the reviewer's heart and mind, and I think that's a really hard answer, or question to answer, because the admission process is not uniform either. There are multiple people who work in admissions, so I mean, it could depend on who reviews your essay, but I think as a policy, you know, it's very important to me that we do have an inclusive, you know, environment, and that would not be a, you know, red mark on their application.
I'd be pretty surprised if any of my admissions our admissions group, we work with pretty closely, just in that we have a pretty small campus. And so, but I do think that disclosure is such a personal and intimate decision. I will say some of the admission counselors told me that last incoming class was the highest number of students that used that in their personal essay, talked about their diagnosis in particular. And I'm not sure if that's because, you know, there's a lot more mental health diagnoses happening now through the pandemic or other scenarios, and it's all probably about framing, right? So if you talk about your disability and how it's been something that you've identified or learned from or showing growth perspective with, that's going to be very different than having a perspective of like, this is an issue and it's going to continue to be an issue and I don't get to see this type of response. That's probably going to be where the difference is. But I can't imagine that folks would see it as a negative mark just to disclose a diagnosis. That being said, we could never guarantee it. I disclose my diagnoses to almost anyone who would listen, but purposely for the point of like trying to make it more comfortable for others and being in a position of power. I feel like, I know, Widener's probably just gonna like understand that now because I've lived it, worked with 7 years. But like for each student, it's definitely their decision. But I can see how it would also be a benefit. So you kind of have to weigh that. I'm wondering if your 411 disclosure booklet for under the bedroom door will be guidance here.
I highly recommend it. Another great resource, which is not specific for college, but I've been doing a lot of work with them lately, so they're on my mind. And as Rebecca mentioned, the same laws that govern college govern, you know, the workplace is the Job Accommodation Network, JAN. I mean, they just have a lot to talk about, a robust and informative website. They have just a wealth of information, and they have some templates in there about disclosure, you know, ways to talk about what your needs are, and just it's a really great resource. Probably more so in a few years for a lot of the students that you're talking about, but definitely now, and just for educational purposes.
I'm actually going to pull that website up because I use that every day.
Every day.
Yeah, Ask Jan is a fantastic website. I think everybody who has a disability should know to use it. Got you. But it also has a way to look at assistive technology, and none of us have actually touched it. But assistive technology is so much of how colleges work with accessibility now. Like things that happen in school that look like note taking for us are often going to be devices or electronics. And Ashton has just been a great resource as far as identifying new things that are popping up, things that we never considered. Like we have a huge nursing program, and like stethoscopes that have like a visual readout for folks who are hard of hearing, like things that I didn't know existed until we started looking into it because of the specific need.
And as she's pulling that up, I'll say like the assistive technology pieces we did mention, I'm not sure how that slipped by any of us, but maybe I thought like maybe somebody else will cover it. But that's something to really think about, that if your child's not using, your student's not using any assistive technology, is that something that could potentially be a solution? And I'm thinking about some of our folks who have reading issues, dyslexia or something else. We in our office, and I think a lot of people will steer them toward things like books in an audio format. And that can be just like a magical resource with the amount of reading that you might be asked to do. But if you've never listened to a book before, ever, and this is your first time doing that, it takes a little bit of getting used to. So that might be something to try in the next few months. You know, something for an English assignment, try listening to it. That's going to be something to use. Anyway.
No, I also think a good question to ask prospective colleges: what assistive technology do you have access to, and what can students expect to have access to through your office? A lot of us do have specific devices that we loan out, or a library, or services that are like usually in a classroom, maybe not like a specific tangible takeaway device, but a service online that folks log into, and then the school pays for that. So I would also ask those questions and those prospective student questions.
Yeah.
in regards to the assistive technology, like over the summer, I think you mentioned that's a good time once you get accepted to go in over the summer before it's all crazy. Is that a good time to maybe go in and really look into what the assistive technologies are, and that you could actually try practicing them over the summer? Before, and that's something that you guys would all be good with?
100%.
Yeah, the school may not, I mean, depending on whether it's a device or a platform or software, the school may not give you access to everything over the summer before you start. But even, I mean, a lot of these things are widely available or low cost, and you could, or there's another version of it, you know, that you can get on your own, and definitely trying it out at a time. Like we're saying, that it's a more low stakes kind of environment to try something new over the summer than when you're reading a book, working on an assignment that, you know, getting it.
I have a question about, my son has seizures, so they're controlled by medicine, but making sure that he gets his medicine all the time, and if he has a seizure at night, it has to be medically intervened for it to stop. How can I assist from miles away, making sure that all this stuff is being taken care of?
Yeah, that's a really difficult situation, complex situation. I think you probably are going to engage multiple stakeholders on the college campus to be part of that solution. Just really starts being part of it. On my campus, I've worked with, you know, and probably these folks do too. We work closely with our residential group. So for any student who needs any accommodations in housing, we're working with them. If we need to have an emergency safety plan, we work with fire and emergency services. That could be what to do in the event of an emergency, like an evacuation plan, but it could also be a personal medical emergency and what the plan is for a caregiver to have access to the building. I'm working with a student now who has like an on-call nurse service. And when there's an alert, you know, that person comes to the campus and has access to the building and works with public safety to get access to the room because they need to be there to check on the well-being and potentially intervene. That took some setting up. That wasn't like, let's do that the second week of classes. You definitely want to start early.
So people with seizures, you guys don't really see a lot of them in your.
Yeah, I mean, we do, but I think we work collaboratively because we are not, you know, medical professionals or first responders or, you know, anything like that. So a lot of times our role is to connect folks to help put a safety plan in place, to put a letter together for professors in case a seizure happens in the classroom, to be in communication with, you know, health and safety services, and to be in contact with the folks in the residence hall because the seizure could happen in any of those settings or somewhere else. Yeah, so you know, I think you want to start early, ask a lot of questions, make sure you're connected with all the right people, and your school's student health office too should have that information because that may be the first responder or that may be the health record that they can't get access to, and so they want to have that information that's not there as well.
I would think that, you know, just in general with this situation, but others as well, is that if you think about like the day-to-day life of your student, your child, are there things where you're the primary intervener, and like how is that going to work at a college campus if they choose to live in a dorm because you won't be there? And generally speaking, that role that you might play, I only mention this because it gets brought up from time to time, cannot be transferred onto a roommate.
Right.
Yeah. That happens from time to time. You know, can this person be trained to do X, Y, Z? And the answer is probably no.
And I think when we have student procedures, the presentations are different from person to person, and it's to have an individualized response.
Right.
But also they are often, because we're a campus setting and a community setting as opposed to like a single high school building, we're not sure what spaces they're going to be in. If somebody at the gym while they're using the treadmill is going to be aware that that's that student and this is their presentation and this is how they need a response. So having like what's the unilateral response if somebody presents with seizure activity, no matter what that seizure activity looks like, if we have students with absent seizures, where it really does not appear how people probably think of seizure in practice, so like folks should know how to respond. across the board, but also with that student's individual needs.
And I think, you know, in terms of preparation for the transition, the healthcare provider who your daughter works with now whether it's the doctor or a social worker as part of their practice, in coming up with the transition plan and the safety plan for college is a key partner in the lead up to. That person has almost certainly worked with someone who's gone to college before and knows your child well. I can say, here's some of the safety measures to put in place when you're not living at home anymore. A lot of people may have, you know, and may already have this, like a medical alert bracelet, something in your phone that comes up on an emergency screen.
Yeah, we have those things.
You know, so, but I think the biggest concern is what happens when no one is there to check those things.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what does the college campus do if somebody has a service dog? How does that work?
The service dog is welcome. Yeah.
Do they live in the dorms and?
Yeah, I mean, we follow the ADA, and so service animals are allowed wherever their handler goes. That one's not even really a request, it's more just a notification. I'm bringing my service dog. But because a student may go into so many different buildings and locations, sometimes they do want, you know, to have that in an accommodation letter so that, say, every professor doesn't stop them and say, what's your dog here? You know, they can get that word out with the backing of the disability or accessibility office to let people know ahead of time this will be happening. For housing, the dog is a resident of the building, so there may be some additional help forms that they need to collect, just like they would for the people who live in the building. That's not a, you know, registration of an animal. It's just more like we need to know that everyone who lives in this building has their shots, including the dogs.
And if there's an emergency that they need to go, that animal is there and the student's not for whatever reason. I think it's so important and I don't want to go too far down this particular rabbit hole, to differentiate between service animals that are trained to do a task and emotional support animals, which often also are able to be on campuses and within like the residential setting. Usually that's under fair housing act. It really depends on the scenario, but those are not animals like specifically trained to do a task. But for a service animal who is, we treat it every time I get a question, so we got to treat it like a wheelchair. That person's going, that animal's going exactly where that person's going because they needed to access the spaces. And so there's not really any other barriers besides just saying, here's my service animal, they are trained to do a task. And that's how we try to disseminate that information to all folks that work here.
Is there a way to get questions from our remote participants, or is the chat turned off?
No, I have not had any.
Okay, I just want to invite it.
Yes, no, I let them know that it was available, and doesn't seem like anybody's had any yet.
That's because the game started already.
Exactly.
When we wanted to do this presentation months ago, nobody thought the most.
Any other questions in the house? No? Thank you all. It was wonderful. We really appreciate your time and your expertise, and thank you all for joining us here at the library tonight. We're happy to have you here.
And I did have somebody just write in saying that they are still here, just no questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.